Right, so it was okay. So in the previous session, we just studied, just began the discussion of economic growth, right? So I explained to you the destructive innovation, right? So because everyone wants to make a profit by becoming a monopoly. The way you become a monopoly is so you have some, like in this they call like killer app or killer product, right? So that you can allure the customer, or you can attract enough adapters. And so at the meantime, because your product or your service is so innovative, that's going to bring us economic growth. But certainly these, let's go to previous slide. But certainly this creative destruction has a huge social cost, right? Because a newer technology makes the existing technology obsolete. So in that sense, it's a cost. All right, anyway, so that's Schumpeter's model in innovation. Now we go to Rostow's stage of growth, right? So I send you two files in the shared folder, so you can have idea, or you have that give you a more background reading of Rostow's idea, right? The interesting things I want to bring to your attention, but this probably just keep you awake. So when I was reading Rostow's bibliography, and so his father came from Russia. So his original name, or his father's original name, is not Rostow. It's Rostowich, or then just like SKY, like a typical Russian name. When his father arrived to the United States, he Americanized his name by converting his name into Rostow. Okay, so basically it just truncate those Russian letters toward the end of his name. And so this is some interesting fact I found. All right, so what is theory? So Rostow, his stage of growth tells us a story of 5 stages for economic growth, right? And before I explain to you this 5-stage growth, I want to point out, so his theory largely based on his observation regarding to Western economy. So that's the big criticism. So he drew, or his theory drew, right? Because this theory was formed in 1960 or right after World War II. And then in the previous lecture, so I show you the growth experience of after World War II, and particularly there are 4 Asian tiger countries, start from 1960 to around like 2000, right? And apparently, so he's the Rostow stage of growth story that doesn't apply those experience very well. So that's a typical criticism. But nevertheless, his theory is interesting to know or interesting to study. Right now, let's see so how his theory plays out. So this 5 stage started with a traditional society, and it's going to characterize by agriculture. Right, so all majority is going to work in the farm. Right, and this economy is going to be self-sufficient. Very little international trade because this is agriculture based. And this is going to last for a long time, potentially a couple of centuries. So this is the starting point, a traditional society. Okay, you can think about like before industrial revolution. So the United States before industrial revolution. You can think about China before economic reform. You can think about before World War II, most of the Asian countries. Right? So this is considered traditional society. This is stage number 1. Now, in the stage number 2, this is called transitional stage. So the economy starts to transit from traditional society to later stage. And in this stage, they are going to have they are going to have preconditions for takeoff. Okay, so in this stage, what things is going to happen? First, there's going to see a surplus of labor in rural Asia or in farm. This is largely because the technology grows. They have better farming techniques, so they can produce same amount or additional amount of food with less hands or less labor. So you have surplus. And furthermore, they have more saving and investment. They start to import some capital goods, okay? And then so the development requires substantial investment in capital. Okay? And this is going to last for a number of decades. And in this transitional period, so to summarize, they have surplus of labor and they start to accumulate investment. This investment is going to go to the next stage. Okay? So it goes to next period. Now we have a takeoff. In this takeoff period, or in the third stage, growth rate starts to accelerate. This period relatively brief, maybe 10 or 20 years. Right? So this takeoff can be triggered by different events or different things. It can initiate by revolutionary, like in South Korea. But it's not always the case. Like the counter example is Cambodia. So yes, they also have a revolution, but instead of takeoff, they went to overlay. And the second possibility of takeoff is through technological breakthrough. They think about industrial revolution in England. Or this can be triggered by institutional development. Okay? Example include, so the invention of a commercial bank, thrift institute, and so on and so forth, or innovation in financial market. So this innovation in financial market just encourage people to take risk and also provide abundant of resource so that we can do some investment into big project or into some innovative but potentially risky project. But if they succeed, that's going to bring enormous amount of premium or enormous amount of technology progress. Sorry, right? So this is the third. Or this can be triggered by foreign investment. Okay, just think about Marshall Plan. This is something I'm going to explain to you later. Marshall Plan. Okay. This was carried out by U.S. government. Okay, and lastly, this can be triggered by economic reforms, like Chinese experience. Okay, so those are the things can trigger a takeoff. Right, but requirement is so the country has surplus of labor and capital, and with this takeoff, with some event that trigger this takeoff, they are going to enter next stage, the drive to maturity. Now in this stage, they have sustained growth. Okay? So in the second stage, they have surplus in labor and investment. In the third stage, so they have this takeoff. Right? So they start to experience this sustained growth in the next stage or in the current stage. All right. And then finally, so once they experience sustained growth, now they enter the age of high mass consumption. Okay. Now the economy moves to mass consumption. Durable consumer goods industry flourish or housing market flourish. Service sector becomes increasingly dominant, and economic security is provided. So what is economic security? In the United States, think about President Lyndon Johnson. So he has an initiative called Great Society. That is, they provide social security, provide pension. Okay, so this is age of high mass consumption. Compared to the previous stage, so in the previous stage, so the society, they devote all the resource in investment. But now, so once they already have experienced sustained growth, they accumulate sufficient amount of wealth, they start to enter high consumption. Also, they cares about social security, cares about social safety net, so on and so forth. And finally, this probably end of stage, so the stage of pursuing quality of life. Okay? They care less about investment, less about consumption, they care about other things. So for example, leisure time, so for example, education, or healthcare, or social welfare. Right? Okay, so this is a stage of growth. This was proposed by Rostow. Right? So here just give you a brief idea how his stage of growth looked like. Again, this theory is based on the observation of Western country. Okay, now let's see. Okay, let me skip this. Now let's see the main criticism. Right, the main criticism goes as follows. First, many economists argue so Rostow's model doesn't set down the detailed nature of the precondition. Right? So what it requires, how to characterize those preconditions, it's not clear. And furthermore, so there's no clear guidance to the policymakers for them to identify the stage, right? And in other words, in terms of policy making, in terms of planning for a country, it's not very practical. Because it's difficult to identify where we are in terms of this 5 stage, and it's difficult to evaluate whether an economy has satisfied those preconditions for takeoff. Right. So other things I want to emphasize is Rostow, his theory has strong influence over U.S. government's foreign aid policy, over U.S. government's view towards Soviet Union. Right? After World War II, Soviet Union and U.S. becomes the 2 superpower, but they have different ideology. They have a different institution, different model of growth, and in some sense, they are competing with each other. Okay, and then so Rostow, now just back to here. So in Rostow's view, for a country, you need to take off the different triggers. Either this can be triggered by revolution, or this can be triggered by, not emphasize here, triggered by foreign investment. And then so you can think about this revolution, probably communist revolution. This foreign investment, you can think about maybe some aid from US or from Western democracy. Okay, so in that sense, Rostow's view has strong influence over US foreign policy. Why is that? Because there are so many countries in the stage of takeoff or in the precondition for takeoff after World War II. So they either is going to under the influence of Soviet Union, and then they take off with some revolution, and then eventually they belong to the Soviet Union's ideological group, or they're going to receive some foreign aid or grant from the US, then they take off eventually adopt American style democracy or economic system. So apparently they are competing each other. And then so the president, I believe that's Kennedy, and so follow Rostow's policy recommendation and then carry out the Marshall Plan. That's the history. And that's Rostow's influence over policy making in the United States. And apparently it has a long-lasting impact on the development of many developing countries. Right. Okay, so now we move to economic development in some select country. so that we have further discussion on other economic theories. Right. So why we look at this section is because the two theory I just explained to you largely based on pre-World War II experience. Right. So now we want to look at experience after World War II, and hopefully from there we can summarize some new insights to guide us in terms of understanding economic growth. Right. Let's look at China's economic growth. This has been a hot topic in economic development. Simply because China has been going through phenomenal economic growth since 1978. 78, that's the year when Chinese economy started to carry out structural reform. Right. Now, if we compare 1978 to 2018, okay, and if we can look at per capita GDP and GDP, okay, both are in real term. What do we see? So in per capita term, increase from 156 to 9,770. So this is, let me see, over 50-fold increase. Right? And so if you look at total, this is also a phenomenon. Right? So the growth is incredible. Okay? Another way to look at the growth experience of China is look at the growth rate. Right? So here, so this looks at absolute value. Now in this slide, I'm going to show you the growth rate, the GDP growth rate, okay, for time period from 1978 to 2010. So we have two time series. The red one is per capita. The red one is per capita. The blue one is total. This is the blue one. Overall, so the total GDP growth is on top of per capita GDP growth. Additionally means over the same time period, so there's a significant amount of population growth. Right. Now, overall, so these two series track each other, and these two series, on average, is probably around here, right? So this average was 8%. Okay, there are only 1 or 2 years they experienced some decline, like here 1989 or in 1980. But for the rest of the period, the growth was stable and significant, average more than 8%. Okay. For comparison, we can look at US GDP growth rate from 1930 to 2009. So if we look at after World War II, is around here, very stable. This is the average. This is stable, right? So you can draw a line here. After World War II is close to 3%. Right? So if we zoom in to look at 1979, or is compared with China in the same time period from here to here, but it's very similar to after World War II. Okay, it's around 3%, compared with 8% we just showed in the previous slide. Okay, now we can look at another country, Japan. Okay, in Japan we look at after World War II. So you may want to look at two time period. 1990, pre-1990. So you can see that the growth rate of Japan is fairly significant, and particularly right after World War II, right? So maybe you can just 1970. And then it's here, and then it's here. Right? So overall, what we saw in Japan. So first, after World War II, this is like recover from the war. The growth rate is very high, 8%. It lasts for around 2 decades or 20 years. And then so the economic growth rate slowed down to around 2 to 3%, like a mature economy experience, for example, US. And unfortunately, after 90, so the growth rate in Japan declined further. At some point becomes negative. All right, so we have seen 3 different countries. They have a drastically different growth experience. Okay. Now we can compare the economy, the world biggest world economy in 2019 and 2020, okay, or the current economy. But certainty, so this 2020 was projection, and the certainty, so we probably need to write down. So instead of growth, so most countries going to, say, the US is probably going like here, and China is probably going to here, and then Japan is going to be here, right? Due to the pandemic, right? Okay, so here to give you a sense, which country has the biggest economy in the world, measured by nominal GDP, right? Oh, so if you're interested, so here is a large table that gives you statistics across countries to look at their wealth, look at, let's see, intangible capital, look at many other things, right? So I'm not going to, so I'm going to skip these details, okay, just for your reference, to see their different experience across countries, right? Similar, here's the population. Now, we are going to move to the third economic series to understand economic growth, right? This is called Harrod-Domar Model. Just remind you, we have just learned 2 models. First model is Schumpeter's destructive innovation. Second is Rostow's stage of growth. Right? So now we move to the third model. Now in this model, different from those previous 2, so we are going to use some math to understand the theory of economic growth. Start with this simple model. Okay? So the key insight of this Harrod-Domar model is the following. Saving must greater than replacement. What this means? So essentially this means, so we must have additional investment, or we must have additional capital formation. Okay, so this additional capital formation through saving that exceed replacement. Replacement essentially, you can think about depreciation, right? So we have this capital formation, and then so the physical capital is going to grow. With more physical capital, then we can produce more, and then so the output is going to grow. So that's how we generate economic growth, right? So this is the insight. To expand the theory, the starting point is this equation. What this equation tells us? Output, Y, is going to be produced by capital. And the capital is only input. The relationship between output and the capital following this linear relationship. And C is a constant. C is the capital output ratio. Because C is defined as K over Y. And what this says? This says 2 things. More capital you have, the more you can produce. This is number 1. Number 2, the less capital intensive, the more you can produce. Right? So let's go 1-1. The more capital you have, the more you can produce. Just imagine, so the size of the factory, the more machinery we have, and then the more we can produce, right? Also want to emphasize, back then, there wasn't such notion called the MPK, the decrease in MPK isn't here yet, right? So we have waited for a few, or maybe 1 or 2 decades to realize that. Okay, this is one thing. Well, this is regarding to capital and output. Okay. Now, lower the capital output ratio, higher the growth. What this means? It just means, okay, so if we require less capital to produce the same amount of output, right? And then so you have increase in capital, and then this is going to translate into larger increase in output, right? Because each output requires less capital. Okay, so this is how we understand this model. But clearly, so there are 2 things is missing, but this is what we're going to discuss in the next model. What are the 2 things? 1, C is not constant. Okay, capital output ratio is not constant. And the 2, so K is not the only input. You're going to see L can also generate output. Right. Now let's finish this model. Okay. Right. So we can do some algebra, right? So change in output is defined by here, because C is a constant. So the change in output only coming from change in capital. Growth rate is going to be defined by change in output divided by output. And then so with this algebra, so we're going to get this, right? Because essentially what we have. So let me just show you the second, the intermediate state. So delta y equal to delta k divided by c, right? And then the whole thing divided by y. And then so we're going to get the last equation. So if we define G as output growth rate, and then so we are going to see G equal to, so here is divided by y times 1 over c. And then what is S? S is a saving. But where does saving coming from? Coming from changing capital. Right, this is here. So changing capital is defined as investment. Investment coming from saving. Right? You may be curious why investment equal to saving. Now you remind yourself in principle of macroeconomics. Now so in a closed economy, okay, I equal to S, because that's the only source for investment. Okay. So finally here we just define S as the saving rate. Is here. Okay. I want to emphasize. So what do we have here? G, I just rewrite here. G growth rate of output equal to S saving rate divided by C. C is capital output ratio. Right. So in this model, so the growth is going to be determined by how much you save and what does your technology look like. Here's the technology. Technology is referred as capital output ratio. Right. So this is the famous Harrod-Domar theory of economic growth. Right. And here just summarize what I just explained to you. Indicating growth rate is determined by saving rate and the capital output ratio, which is assumed to be constant. And here this line explains to you the implication of Harrod-Domar growth model. Here example. If a country has a capital output ratio of 3, saving rate of 9%, then growth rate is 3%. Okay. So we can do further analysis regarding to the model. Now, if we define incremental capital output ratio, which is defined as increase in capital divided by increase in output. Okay. So example. So if the capital increased by 3,000, output increased by 1,000, and the incremental capital output ratio equal to 3. But apparently in this model, capital output ratio is constant, then incremental capital output ratio is going to be constant as well. Right? It's summarized by here. Okay, I'm going to skip the details. So essentially C equal to delta K divided by delta Y, and here's an example. Right, so this is Harrod-Domar model. Now, we can look at some examples. Examples of production function that is consistent with constant capital output ratio. And from here, you can see what is the limitation of this theory. And then from here, we can see some light of, or some hint of improvement. Right. So first example, Y equal to K over C, and C is constant equal to 3. That is first example. And the second example, we introduce labor. And then the output function equal to, I forgot there's a bracket. Minimum of AK versus BL. Both A and L, they are constant. Okay? In your intermediate microeconomics, you probably have seen this function before. If you plot this production function, it's going to look like this kink line. This two line. All right? And how we understand this kink line? Essentially, your level, because this compared to this, you are going to have higher, different level, right? So let's give you Y. And the level, so or in other words, we move toward this direction, you're going to see Y increase. You move toward this direction, Y is decreasing, right? So let me erase everything and then explain to you what this means, or how we understand this, right? So if you so move to this direction, you increase K and L, and then Y is going to increase. If we move to that direction, you decrease K and L, so Y is going to decrease, right? But then, so what is going to determine where you are in terms of Y? Actually, you're determined by the smallest between K and L, right? So the smallest, because once you have, say for example here, right? So once you have a level of K, you increase L, doesn't change. Or once you have a level of L, you increase K, doesn't help, right? And in microeconomics, so this type of things, we have another name. It's called perfect complement. Think about your utility from, let's say for example, replace this with right-hand side, right shoes. This is your left-hand side shoes. And this is, instead of Y, this is your utility. Okay, and your utility is going to depend on the least amount of shoes you have. If you have one, this here is 2 right-hand side shoes. Okay, whether you have 4, you have 6 left-hand side shoes, it doesn't help. What you need is 2 left-hand side shoes. On the other hand, if you have 2 left-hand side shoes, whether you have 4 or 6 right-hand shoes, doesn't help. Okay, so you're going to have the same utility as 2. So this is called perfect complement, right? Because you need to have left-hand side shoes and right-hand side shoes 1-to-1. But in these examples, you have K and L in a constant fraction. And this fraction is going to be determined by the slope of this straight line. Okay. And then, so once we understand the relationship characterized by this kink line, okay, and you should realize, I hope you can realize, there is a limitation for this model. Right? So in reality, capital and labor, they are not perfectly complements. Right? So we can use labor to substitute for capital. For example, just think about a farmer, right? So farmer, yes, ideally, so they have a tractor, it's going to be very productive. But they can use, say, for example, 100 or 1,000 farmers to use their hand to what? To substitute for a tractor. But this story I just tell you did not exist in this diagram. Right? So you have one tractor versus 1,000 worker. It's going to give you the same amount of product as one worker, one tractor and one worker. But that's not true, right? So in reality, you can use a huge amount of labor to replace capital. All right, so this is something we need to pick up in the next model. But for now, make sure you understand how does Harrod-Domar model works. Okay. And to close this model, another thing I want to tell you is, as I mentioned earlier, capital output ratio, they are not constant. Same country, it changes over time. Same time period varies, right? Any question before I move to the next model? Because we have talked about a lot of theory today. It's pretty heavy lifting today. Any question? So I want to pause for a second. Are we awake?
No questions.
Yeah, we're still here.
Oh, okay, very good, very good.
Professor, are we gonna have time to ask you about the homework at the end of the class?
Yes, okay, so given you talk about that, so let me just pause for now, because this is what we're going to discuss next. So now let me just maybe switch to homework, because I understand, so there are too much theory today. Now let's go to homework. Just bear me with a second. And let me open my homework, and so we can discuss that for sure. All right, so let me switch my computer. Right. So you can see my screen, right? Can you?
Yep.
Yes.
Okay, so let's just go, because we have only two questions, right? So question number one is clear, no?
Yes.
Okay, so I guess the question is regarding to homework question number two, right?
Well, on number one, are we supposed to use the number one footnote? Is that the database you want us to look at?
Yes. You have other data source, it's up to you, but these are the two base data I'm aware of.
Okay.
So I can just show you. So this is World Bank data, right? So for example, so what you want to do, so you want to look at GMP. So you want to look at GMP. Right, so unfortunately they do not have GMP. And then so you want to look at GDP maybe. Right, but then the GDP, they have many different variables.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, make sure you understand what they mean. Now, for comparison, you probably want to use, like, some of them here. This is a fixed currency.
So we're supposed to be filling in that chart from the first lecture, and it was asking for GNP per capita.
Yeah.
Looking at those charts, it looked like GNP per capita. Is that the same thing? Or GNI, I mean?
No, so GNI, let me see. So I don't know what's GNI. Just give me a second. So do you know the difference between GNP and GDP?
Yes.
Okay. So GNI, I'm not sure. So
it says like in the overview or details section, it says GNI per capita, formerly GNP per capita is the gross national income.
Oh, I see. Okay, so yes, you can use that for sure. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, and by the way, so people who are not familiar with this, so if you download this file, you're going to see the data for the entire world for different countries. If you download here, if you click here, okay? Yeah. So this is question number 1. Now question number 2. So the hard part of question number 2 is you need to get data, right? So now we can try here. So I can only give you a hint. Otherwise it just means I work for you, right? So you're supposed to work you're supposed to learn this by doing. Right? Say for example, capital. And then so if you type capital, they're going to have a lot of different things. Right? So they have capital formation. And then they have net capital account. Unfortunately, neither are what we're looking for. So capital formation essentially is investment, like new capital, right? So which means you probably need to look at different source. Let's just go to here. So this Federal Reserve Bank at St. Louis. Let's see whether they have. Let's see, capital. Now let's show called capital stock. Okay, so you may want to look at this one, but this is capital stock for United States. Right, okay, and then so maybe you can just try. So which country I ask you? So okay, so let's just say capital stock India. Okay. Does that make sense?
And then do
Are
we
you
have
with me?
for each country then for China, India, South Korea, and Thailand?
Right.
Okay.
Right. But this is for capital stock.
Yep.
Okay. Now, so yeah, so capital stock. So you may want to make notes. But again, given this class is already recorded, you can watch that again. For capital stock, what you need is just look at this variable. So this is, but certainly you can find a better variable. This is one variable you can use, right? So this capital stock. Now we look at labor supply. And the labor supply, and then becomes tricky, right? So you probably need to review your principal class. So for labor supply, there are at least 2 things. One is employment. Okay, let's say we're gonna employment India. Right? So if you type employment India, then so what are you gonna see? Most relevant indicator is employment to population ratio. Okay, you want to make notes. So employment. So I can just use my notes, just kind of explain to you. So what do we do next? Okay. Okay. So what do we have here? So you have employment to population ratio. Sorry? So this is the first indicator we have. Now the other things we want to look at is hours worked. Okay. So maybe you can look at here. Let's just say, for example, okay, average annual hours worked per employee person. All right, so now let me just go to my notepad. Now, how we are going to make sense of these two numbers? So employment to population ratio, this is equal to what? Anyone knows? This is numbers of employed person divided by what? Divided by population, right? Okay, and here, so what is our hours work per employed person? That is what? That just the hours. I mean, this is literally just this name says everything, right? So this just each worker, how many hours they work, right? So now why I need both numbers? If you multiply, let's just call this, the first one is called E, okay, it's defined as E. And the second one, let's define as H. Now, if E times H, that's going to give you what? What does this gives you? Anyone?
Is it just like total hours worked for the entire working population?
Very close. So essentially, if you multiply E with H, what that's going to give you, it is going to give you average annual hours of work. What's going to here is per person, right? Why? Because H is average hours worked per employed person. Now E is what is employment means how many employed person per person, right? Because not everyone work. Now you use E times H, that's going to give you average annual hours work per person, right? And then finally, what you need to find out P. P is defined as population. So you can easily find that in either World Bank data or FRED data. So, okay, now you're ready to go. So you're going to use E times H times P. What is it going to give you? This is going to give you total hours work in the economy. Does this make sense to you?
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay, so once you find out total hours worked, and these corresponds to what? Correspond to N, right? Now go to here. So that's correspond to what? Or L, either way, labor supply, right? So, or in other words, labor supply is measured, the precise measure is what? It's the total hours of work in the economy, everybody. So now you get L. Okay? And for GDP, so that should be fairly straightforward, right? So it's like GDP India, right? So there are many different variables. Make sure you use the same variable for all the countries you discussed. All right? Is that clear?
Yes.
Okay. So now, so I explained to you how you find out K, how you find out L, how you find out Y. Okay, so this A is done, right? Now B, how are we gonna get a B? So B, so essentially you just follow this formula. Right? Because you have Y from the first step, K from here, L from here. You know alpha. And then so you can calculate this number. Right? No question for that, right?
Nope.
Okay. Now C, calculate growth rate for above variables. Now you have K, L, GDP, TLP. And then so you can use Excel, easily calculate the growth, right? Okay, so basically where we are, so now we can calculate GY, or you can call it GY. You can calculate GK. You can calculate GL. And finally, you can calculate GTFE. Okay, so this is step C. Right? Now we go to step D. So step D, remember, so in the class, I just explained to you, so we suppose have this relationship. Right? So that's what we just discussed in first session today. No? And then step D essentially just asks you to find out what is this number divided by G of Y. And I just explained to you what this means, right? What this means, the contribution of capital to growth, right? More specifically, it's contribution of capital accumulation. Okay? Is that clear? Now we go to step D. What is step D? I give an example in section 1, right? So for example, so if for one country you find out the contribution of K to growth is, say for example, 30%, and L is 20%, and TFP must be how much percent? Anyone tell me? What would be the TFP, the contribution of TFP to GDP growth? Anybody? Just look at this equation. They must add up equal to 1, right? So this must be 50%. No? So then, so essentially in step E, I just ask you how we interpret the number. And then, so what this means, this just means TFP contributes the most, right? And so you may have a country maybe looks like the following. Let's see, let's just exaggerate a little bit. And then so we need what? We need to change the K. Right? And furthermore, if you look at these two countries, which one do you think doing better and which one do you think is more sustainable? The first one, or I mean, the one on the top or one on the bottom? What do you think?
The bottom.
Why is it bottom? Because bottom, so this country relies on capital accumulation. Capital accumulation typically coming from where? Coming from saving, right? Do you think so it is sustainable? We just keep saving and then so we have GDP growth, or we just keep innovating and then so we have GDP growth? Which one do you think is better, or which one do you think is more sustainable?
I think
Or which one do you prefer? Think about which country do you prefer to live? Maybe just in plain language. You want to say live a country, so most of the growth coming from like innovation, versus the country, so the growth coming from everyone needs to tighten their belt. Don't consume, just save like crazy, and so hopefully we can have growth. Which one do you think is better?
I think innovation's better.
Innovation is better, right? Well, yes. So I haven't explained to you like the background, because essentially right now I just give you like a black box, right? So in terms of this equation, in terms of okay, so why K contributes the most, and then so it can be from saving. But this is exactly what we're going to discuss next. But in this homework, so that's what you're supposed to understand. Here I just give you two examples, or fictional examples, right? So what you need to do is literally dive into the data, like look at China, India, South Korea, Thailand. Or if you wish, you can look at your home country, or you can look at the country you are interested in, but do the same things as I asked you to do. So you are not confined to look at these 4 countries, right? So you can look at whatever country you are interested in. But the point of this homework is first give you a good practice in terms of data. And this, number 2, understand growth accounting. And number 3, this is a good exercise for you to interpret the data, like I just showed you here. Okay? Did I answer your concern or question regarding the homework?
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay. So I can close this, right? Because whenever you want to refer the discussion here, you can just go to YouTube, right? I'm going to upload either tonight or tomorrow morning. Or if you want, you can take a picture right now. Everyone on the same page?
Yeah.
Okay. Very good. So now let me just kill this one, because the computer is running like crazy. Okay, so now we back to our business here. Oh, let's keep crashing. Okay, this is where we left, right? So we are toward the end of Harrod-Domar Model. Let's just back a few slides. Okay, so Harrod-Domar Model relies on a very particular production function. Okay, how this production function in particular? Essentially, it must have a constant capital output ratio. Okay, so here we have two examples. Okay, and clearly, so this violates to reality. Okay, look at here. Look at the same country over time, capital output ratio change. Look at the same time period across the country, the capital output ratio varies. Okay? So that just tells us, so this may not be a good theory, or we need to move forward. So now we are in new classical growth model. So this model was originally proposed by Solow. This is called new classical, largely because this growth theory is built upon new classical economics. Right? So this new classical economics assume perfect competition, assume there's no friction in the economy, right? And then so focus on our interests. This new classical growth theory largely is related to production function. Now, so this production function takes the form, actually typically we call it new classical production technology. This new classical production technology has a bunch of properties. And this property coming from the observation of data. Okay? And so the most prominent property is, so instead of constant capital output ratio, right? So this capital output ratio may change. It's going to change with the amount of capital or the amount of labor you utilize. Right? Now, let's see a typical production function assumed or utilized by new classical growth theory. So this is a typical production function. We have seen that before in the previous chapter. And in the previous chapter, we just take that as given, right? And here we are going to see is, okay, so now if you have this type of production function, how the economy is going to behave in the long run. In the previous chapter, what's the difference? We just take the data as given, right? We do not have a theory to explain. So why the data, why the data behave as it is? Now here we are going to open the black box. And so start from this production function. And we provide a theory to explain, so why the data behave as it is. Okay, so that's what we are going to do. So first, let me explain to you the production function, okay, or the property of this production function. Okay, so here, this is what we call the ISO quant. So the ISO quant comes from two parts. ISO means, it means the same basically. Quant means quantity, and essentially means, okay, along this line, okay, along this line, you have same output, right? But you can have different combination. Now, remind you what we just showed earlier. So in earlier, so the isoquant, if you have this isoquant, so the Harrod-Domar model requires the isoquant is going to look like this, right? So you have certain amount of labor. You change your capital, doesn't help. You have a certain amount of capital, you change labor, doesn't help. But this is not true, right? As I just explained to you earlier. So in reality, so think about a farmer or the farming sector. So they can use farmer to replace for capital, or they can use capital to replace formula as you substitute. So this is reflected by this idea, right? Look at it here. Okay, look at it here versus here. Okay, so what's the difference? So if you compare C versus B, clearly B has less capital, but more labor, right? But in these two, they have same amount of output. Right? So meaning, so we use labor to substitute for capital. This did not exist in the production function we saw in Harrod-Domar Model. Okay, so this is the first sense I want to emphasize. Okay, another property regarding to this new classical production technology is called a constant return to scale. What does this mean? This means, okay, so if you look at it here, so this is a production function. If you scale up or scale down each factor in the same scale or in the same magnitude, and then you're going to scale up or scale down the output in the same magnitude. Or more generally, so you're going to see y equal to f k l, right? So you're going to scale this by c, scale by this c, and then you're going to scale this by c. What's the implication of this? This implication is, so merger and acquisition doesn't make any difference, right? So this is new classical production technology. Certainly it has its limitation, but this is just for theoretical simplification, but also it has its applications, right? But this is what this means, right? So constant return to scale. This constant return to scale has very nice property. This is going to facilitate analysis. How? Let me show you. So if we scale this by the amount of hours work or labor, let's change this C to L. Okay, and then so what we're going to have, so here Y divided by L, this is essentially the per capita. Now so let's use Y. This is equal to F, so K over L is per capita. Now let's use K, per capita capital. Now L divided by L is a constant Y. So then so we can simply write this as Y equal to F of K. Now, very nice property. So now everything in terms of per capita term, right, this is here. Okay? So we erase these and then we move forward. Okay. So this is summarized by here. Now let's see how this model evolves. Okay? Evolves. Or how the dynamics looks like. Okay, so we are trying to understand the dynamics of the model. Now, why we want to introduce dynamics? This is to address the question I just raised. So we want to understand or explain why data looks like what we observe, or what is the theory behind the data we observe, or we want to make sense of the data, right? So then we need to look at the dynamics of this model. Okay. All right, so the dynamics of this model is going to hinge on capital accumulation. And why? Largely because of this equation. And where this equation coming from? Coming from constant return to scale. Okay, now we are going to focus on capital accumulation. Start with aggregate capital. Now this is the equation. So what is delta K? Delta K is changes in aggregate capital. Changes in aggregate capital. So what can cause changes in capital? And then economically, there are two sources, right? So number one, you save. Remember, we are in a closed economy. Any penny we save goes to investment. And there's no foreign investment, right? So this is one way you can change the capital. What else? The other thing is, earlier we talked about replacement. But in economics, actually instead of talking replacement, we call depreciation. What is depreciation? Think about your car, it's going to turn down. Your smartphone eventually is going to slow down and you want to get a new smartphone. Right? Your house is going to deteriorate. So this is called depreciation. Right? Okay, so the saving typically increase capital stock and the depreciation is going to reduce capital stock. We add them together, so this is how the capital is going to change over time. So the change in capital coming from saving minus depreciation. But remember here, everything is in aggregate. Let me erase everything and I highlight. Okay, so this is aggregate. Okay, coming from saving and depreciation. For simplicity, here we assume saving rate, depreciation are given. Okay, so this saving rate is given, you can understand there is some orders or there's some instruction from the government. Everybody is going to save a constant fraction of their income. This is given. There's no theory on saving. All right, so now we understand this aggregate, so we are going to convert this aggregate into per capita term. Why we want to do that? Coming from here. Again, to remind you why we have this equation coming from constant return to scale. Right? So now how we are going to convert this aggregate in per capita. Now erase everything again. So now we are getting there. So this is where we are, aggregate. And this is per capita. All right? And then essentially we divide both sides by L. And here L is labor. And in this model, we simplify this labor is also equal to population. What this means? Means everyone is working. Everyone works 100%. This is for simplicity. Okay, now we end up with this equation. Okay, with this equation, I'm going to skip the details, and again, I explain to you the detail next class. So with this equation, at the end, you're going to see this is a key equation. Okay, let me highlight. This key equation tells you how per capita evolves over time. And this equation, economic interpretation for this equation goes as follows. So over time, the changes in per capita capital coming from three sources. Number one, you save. That's going to increase capital stock. Number two, depreciation. That's going to reduce capital stock. Number three, and here is the population growth. It's going to decrease. And why? And it's going to decrease capital stock per capita, essentially because of the dilution. Today, we have one person share one computer or use one computer. And tomorrow, because you have two persons because of the population growth, and then in per capita term. So suddenly we move from 1 to 1/2. So this is captured by this n. Okay, let me erase. Okay. We came a long way, so now this is the key equation. We are going to study the dynamics of the economy. Right? So there are three things that determine the capital stock over time: saving, depreciation, population growth. Right? And this comes from here, so we convert everything in per capita term. All right? So, okay, so now today I'm going to stop here. And the next week, we will pick up from here. Okay? So in the meantime, please work on your homework.